So turn there with me. 2 Samuel 23. We're going to look at verses 8 through 12. 23, 8 through 12. Listen to this. This is way later, years later, at the end of David's life. This is an epilogue of all the guys who hung out with him and were significant. It says this. These are the names of David's mighty men. Josheb-Basshebeth, a Tachmonite, was chief of the three. He raised a spear against 800 men whom he killed in one encounter. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai the Ahohite. As one of the three mighty men, he was with David when they taunted the Philistines gathered at Pasdamim for battle. Then the men of Israel retreated, but he stood his ground and struck down the Philistines till his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. Next to him was Shammah, son of Agi the Hararite. When the Philistines banded together at a place where there was a field full of lentils, Israel's troops fled from them, but Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field. He defended it, and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. This passage describes 30 men who followed David. 30 incredible soldiers. 30 mighty men, it tells us. And the guys we just looked at are called the three. They were the top of the heap. And you know what? It's just possible. We don't know this for certain. But it's just possible some of the 30, and maybe even some of the three, were from that original hobo group. They hung around with David long enough, and they developed into something fascinating, something amazing, something remarkable. Now, we don't know, but I do know this. If David did not have the 400 borderline losers, he never would have made it to the point in his life where he could have 3 incredible winners. 30 incredible winners. Here's the lesson from that. Lesson number 2. The very people he invested in became his best assets. The very people he invested in became his best assets. When I first moved to Lafayette, some of you know this story, I got involved with a coffee house right downtown here. It's called the Skylight Coffee House. In fact, it's where we get our coffee from each Sunday morning. Hope you like it. But the Skylight Coffee House is just on the other side of the courthouse on 3rd Street. And I got involved there, and I was feeling like I wanted to really make a connection with the community. So when we were known as Southside Church at the time, and this was about a year before we had any public worship services, so we're talking 2006. Anyway, I built a relationship with the guy who owned the place, and I asked him if I could help out with the open mic night they did on Thursday nights. So I started hosting it. I started doing that once a month, and I was, trying to build some relationships. And one of the guys I met there was a guy named Mark, a fascinating guy. Dreadlocks. He was really, really good at rap, hip-hop, but he also had a beautiful singing voice. I recruited him a number of times to be in our band, and it never worked out. But he's kind of a unique individual, an eccentric kind of guy who's done a lot of traveling and stuff. And so I wanted to invest in this guy for a little bit. And so I called him up and I said, hey, I want to interview you. Because at the time I was trying to put together some type of website that would, profile the local artists in the area. But, that's a long time ago. Anyway, I met this guy. We went over to the Skylight and we sat down for a cup of coffee, and I brought my tape recorder. I was going to record him. We were going to have a conversation. And we played a game of chess, and he won it, and won the second game too. But I was close a couple of times. But, my ulterior motive was I'm trying to build relationships with people who might be interested in this church that we're trying to get off the ground. And I met with him. He wasn't too interested. I met with him again a couple months later, and he wasn't too interested. I maintained a cordial relationship with him, and we met periodically and kind of talked on the phone now and then. Every time I saw him, I tried to encourage him. A couple times he showed up at our church, and then after we got started, and then didn't show up very much. And, so the relationship, I was trying to invest, but it never seemed like it was coming up to any kind of fruit. Until this last year at Easter, when we were meeting at the Holiday Inn, and the Holiday Inn told us we couldn't meet there anymore because they had already booked Easter Sunday. Now, for a church not to be in its regular place on Easter Sunday was really scary for me. And I started making phone calls. I called the Lawn Center here because I was just freaked out. Turns out Mark was working here at the time and volunteered to work for us on Easter Sunday so that we could be here. Many of you know that story. But even more than that, Mark's introduced me to other people who are, I think we might actually have one of Mark's friends up in this band sometime pretty soon. I think he's here today because I saw him, and so some of you might be able to try to find out who he is and just give him a big hug for me. Because I invested in a relationship with Mark that I didn't think was bearing much fruit. And years later, amazing things come about. We're here in this building today because of that relationship. I'll tell you another story. I was out when we first moved to town, 2006. I was bored out of my mind one day because very few people were responding to anything I was trying to do. And I decided, well, I'm just going to go to the local disc golf course and throw the disc around a little bit and see if I can meet anyone there. So I go out there and I throw the disc around, and I'm terrible. But I find someone else who looks like he knows what the course is supposed to be. And I go up to him and I approach him. I say, hey, would you mind throwing the disc with me and walk me through this course? He said, sure. I asked him what his name is. He says his name is Jerry. Turns out his daughter and my son are in the same class at We Are Ridge Elementary School. We begin to invest a little bit in conversation during that day, but I find out he's committed to his church. He's already involved in a church, he's committed to it, and they're not really interested in switching. And, you know, I don't really want to draw people from other churches necessarily anyway, but I said, okay. I maintained some contact with him periodically, and lo and behold, it turns out that this guy has some pretty significant resources, and last month, he gives me a phone call and says, we'd like to make a donation to your church for some end-of-the-year giving. Now, I didn't meet the guy thinking, here's a guy who could give us some money. I met the guy thinking, I wonder what this relationship could be like. Now, friends, I just want to encourage you. I don't know what kind of uncertain relationships you might have in your present or your future, or maybe sitting right next to you today, but the promise of God still applies, that the uncertainties of today can turn into the wonderful of tomorrow. Snapshot number 2 of the life of David. I'm going to take you to snapshot number 3, which I think is even more deeply, profoundly moving for me personally. It's a passage I read briefly last fall, but today we're going to talk about it just a little bit more. It's still 2 Samuel 23, but now we're in verse 13. Look at it with me. During harvest time, 3 of the 30 men